It's a warm night and you're standing near a fire. Maybe it's a bonfire on a beach. Maybe it's a fire pit in a backyard. Maybe it's just a single candle on a table in front of you. The flames shift, a curl of gray smoke drifts up, and it bends, the way smoke always seems to, directly into your face. And here's the thing you've definitely done without ever thinking about it. Instead of pulling away in disgust, some quiet part of you leans in. You breathe it. There's something about the smell of wood smoke that feels less like a warning and more like a memory. Like coming home to a place you've never been. We treat that as totally normal. But stop for a second. Because hidden inside that tiny automatic moment is one of the strangest and oldest stories about what it means to be human. This is the story of how we started smoking. And no, I don't mean cigarettes, and I don't mean the person standing outside the bar that you somehow end up in a 40-minute conversation with. I mean the very first time a human being deliberately, on purpose, pulled burning smoke into their lungs because they wanted to. And the answer to when that happened might be tens of thousands of years older and far stranger than you would ever guess. Because here's the part nobody tells you. The urge to inhale smoke doesn't begin with tobacco. It doesn't begin with ancient trade routes, or sacred ceremonies, or even farming. The desire to breathe something burning may be wired into you on a level so deep that it predates civilization itself. So to understand it, we have to go all the way back, before cities, before language as you'd recognize it, to the one thing that had to come first: fire. You cannot smoke anything until you can make fire, and fire has been part of our story for a staggeringly long time. The oldest solid evidence we have of our ancestors controlling fire comes from a place called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, and it dates back roughly 1 million years. Deep inside that cave, scientists found burnt bone and the ashed remains of plants. Not the chaotic scattering you'd get from a wildfire sweeping through, but the quiet, contained signature of a fire that was tended on purpose, inside, in the dark. And 1 million years ago, the creature sitting beside that fire wasn't even you. It wasn't Homo sapiens. It was Homo erectus, an earlier cousin with a smaller brain and a heavier brow, who had nonetheless figured out the single most important trick in the human playbook. Now picture that. Picture an ancestor of yours, 100,000 generations back, huddled in the mouth of a cave against the cold. The fire is the only warmth, the only light, the only safety. So they sit close to it, every night. And every night, for hundreds of thousands of years, every single one of your ancestors who ever sat by a fire breathed in its smoke. They had no choice. It was constant. It was unavoidable. It was, if you think about it, the original air quality problem. And nobody had an app to warn them about it. Breathing smoke wasn't a habit. For most of human history, it was simply what being alive smelled like. But here is where the story takes its first turn, the one that should give you pause. Not all smoke is the same. When you burn plain wood, you get carbon and water vapor and not much else of interest. But when you burn other plants, certain leaves, certain seeds, certain resins, you release a chemical cocktail. Some of those compounds are psychoactive. They drift up in the smoke. You breathe them in, they cross into your blood through your lungs, and they reach your brain. And in a forested, plant-rich world, your ancestors would have been burning all kinds of vegetation without the faintest idea what was in it. Which means some of them, sitting innocently by the fire on an ordinary evening, were getting high, and had absolutely no idea why they suddenly felt so wonderful. Now you might be thinking, that sounds like a nice story, but isn't that just speculation? It's a completely fair question. So here's the evidence that makes it more than a guess. Your brain comes pre-built with a system of receptors, part of what's called your endocannabinoid system, that helps regulate your mood, your memory, your appetite, your sense of pain. These receptors did not evolve because of any plant. They are a standard part of being human. But it means that the very first time one of your ancestors inhaled smoke from a burning psychoactive plant, their brain didn't sit there confused, wondering what was happening. Their brain had a lock that this strange new key fit perfectly. The effect would have been immediate and unmistakable. And that single accidental moment, a tired forager sitting downwind of the wrong bush on the wrong, or rather the very right, evening, may be the true birth of smoking. Not a decision, not a plan, just a wonderful accident, stumbled into, remembered, and eventually, deliberately repeated. Sit with how absurd and beautiful that is. The entire history of human smoking, every ritual, every sacred pipe, every medicine, possibly the whole trillion-dollar empire that came much later, may trace back to one exhausted ancestor who simply had an unexpectedly excellent night beside a fire and wanted to feel it again. History, sometimes, is written by happy accidents. But there's a crucial distinction we have to be honest about, because there's a big difference between humans breathing smoke that happen to be psychoactive and humans deliberately growing and burning specific plants to get an effect. So let's follow the actual clues, like a detective, and see how far back the deliberate version goes. High in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, archaeologists excavated a burial site dating to roughly 2,500 years ago. Inside, they found wooden braziers holding stones that had been heated until they glowed, and on those stones, the burnt residue of cannabis, with an unusually high level of the compound that gets you high. This wasn't the everyday plant grown for rope and seeds. This was strong, selected, potent, and placed carefully into a ritual for the dead. 2,500 years ago, someone was deliberately heating these plants to release their smoke, for a purpose. And it gets better, because we have an eyewitness. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 2,500 years ago, described a people called the Scythians, nomads of the Great Eurasian Steppe. He wrote that they would build small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glowed, throw hemp onto them, then sit inside and breathe the rising smoke, and in his words, they would howl with joy. For centuries, historians read that and assumed the old man was exaggerating, telling tall tales about distant barbarians. And then archaeologists started digging into Scythian burial mounds, and they found them. The bronze braziers, the heated stones, the hemp residue. Exactly, precisely what Herodotus described. He hadn't been exaggerating at all. If anything, he had been underselling it. Now, here's a question you should be holding in the back of your mind. If our oldest hard evidence is only a couple of thousand years old, does that mean smoking is only a couple of thousand years old? And the answer is almost certainly no, and here's why. Think about what survives in the ground for millennia. Stone survives. We find stone tools that are millions of years old, because stone is nearly indestructible. But a wooden pipe? A pouch of dried leaves? A handful of seeds? Those rot away in a few centuries under ordinary conditions, gone long before any archaeologist arrives with a brush. So when it comes to smoking, the absence of evidence is absolutely not evidence of absence. The behavior is almost guaranteed to be far older than the oldest object we've ever managed to dig up. The artifacts are just the tiny, fireproof tip of a very large, very flammable iceberg. Which brings us to the plant most people actually picture when they think of smoking: tobacco. And tobacco has a secret that surprises almost everyone. It is native only to the Americas. That single fact reshaped the world, because it means that for almost all of human history, the entire Old World, all of Europe, all of Africa, all of Asia, had never seen it. When European ships reached the Caribbean in 1492, the sailors watched, baffled, as local people walked around with small glowing bundles of dried leaves, pulling the smoke into their mouths and letting it drift back out through their noses. The crew thought it was bizarre. And then, of course, within weeks, the crew were trying it themselves. Because that is exactly the kind of creature we are. But here's what really matters about tobacco in the ancient Americas. It was not casual. It was not a quick break on the way to do something else. It was sacred. Tobacco was used in healing, in sealing agreements between peoples, in reaching toward the spirit world. To blow smoke over someone was an act of blessing. Picture a healer, in total silence, gently breathing smoke over a sick child, believing that the smoke itself was a living messenger carrying prayers upward and visions downward. That is a universe away from lighting up out of boredom while waiting for a bus. The idea of smoking as an idle, everyday habit is, almost entirely, a very recent invention. For thousands of years, this was a thing you treated with reverence. And now the bombshell, the discovery that quietly rewrote the timeline. And it's the part of this story almost nobody has heard. In a remote stretch of Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert, at a place archaeologists named the Wishbone Site, researchers were carefully excavating an ancient hunter-gatherer fireplace. And inside that hearth, they found 4 tiny charred seeds of wild tobacco. Radiocarbon dating put that fireplace at around 12,300 years old. Let that number land. Until that discovery, the oldest evidence of tobacco use was a pipe with nicotine residue dating back about 3,300 years. This single find pushed the human relationship with tobacco back by roughly 9,000 years, deep into the Ice Age. These weren't seeds that blew in by accident, and they don't burn well enough to be fuel. The nearest place that plant grew was miles away, across rough country. Someone carried it there, on purpose. 12,000 years ago, while mammoths still walked the earth, a small band of people sat around a fire, and tobacco was part of whatever they were doing. And that raises a thought that's genuinely a little dizzying. If people in North America were deliberately using tobacco 12,000 years ago, what were people on every other continent doing with their own local plants at exactly the same time? Because 12,000 years ago, humans were everywhere: Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia. And the drive to alter your own mind, to chase a different state of consciousness, is not an American thing or a European thing. It looks an awful lot like a human thing. In fact, some respected researchers take that idea very seriously, and it has a name: the intoxication hypothesis. The argument goes like this: in virtually every human culture ever recorded, people have found ways to alter their consciousness. They've fermented drinks, eaten strange mushrooms, chewed leaves, and breathed smoke. This behavior is so universal, so stubborn, and so independently invented all over the world that some scientists believe it isn't a cultural accident at all. One psychopharmacologist proposed that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and the urge to reproduce. And it isn't even limited to us. Elephants will go out of their way for fermented fruit. There are reports of reindeer deliberately seeking out certain mushrooms in Siberia for their effects. The pull toward an altered state seems to run through the whole animal kingdom. If that drive really is this old and this deep, then it is entirely reasonable to imagine that early humans, long before pottery, long before farming, long before any pipe was ever carved, were intentionally breathing the smoke of certain plants, because they had learned, through pure trial and error, that it changed something inside them. And that trial and error was deadly serious. Some plants make you feel transcendent. Some plants kill you. And in a world without labels, the only way to learn the difference was to watch what happened to the person who tried it first. The ones who survived remembered. They passed it on, mouth to ear, around the fire, across generations that never wrote a single word down. That is how almost all human knowledge worked for almost all of human history. Not in libraries, not in schools, in lived, dangerous, hard-won experience, whispered in the dark. Here's something else that rarely gets mentioned in this story. Long before smoke was recreational, and even alongside when it was spiritual, it was medicine. One of the oldest medical documents in the world, an Egyptian text from around 3,500 years ago, describes treating ailments by having patients inhale the smoke of heated herbs. The famous Greek physician, whose name doctors still swear an oath to, wrote about breathing in herbal vapors to treat the lungs. Ancient Indian medicine, going back thousands of years, describes a practice that translates literally to smoke drinking, with detailed instructions on which herbs for which conditions. From a modern view, this sounds insane, treating your lungs by filling them with smoke. But the underlying logic isn't crazy. The lungs are a fast, direct doorway into the bloodstream. And that idea never died. The next time you see someone use an asthma inhaler, you're watching the same ancient principle at work. The delivery method survived. Thankfully, we mostly dropped the burning part. There's one more reason this habit may have stuck so hard, and it has to do with the fact that you are, at your core, a profoundly social animal. For nearly all of human history, being alone meant dying, and belonging to a tight, trusting group meant living. So anything that strengthened the bonds within a group had real survival value. And a shared ritual, a circle of people entering an altered state together, is one of the most powerful bonding tools that exists. Modern neuroscience shows that shared rituals actually synchronize people's brains and deepen their trust in measurable ways. So, when a group of your ancestors sat together in the dark, breathing the same smoke, drifting into the same strange state side by side, that wasn't just a party. That was social technology. That was how you built the kind of bone-deep trust that let people walk into danger together and come back alive. The smoke circle wasn't an indulgence, it was infrastructure. Which makes the final chapter of this story all the more jarring. Because the journey from sacred smoke to mass-market product is, frankly, one of the steepest moral drops in human history. When tobacco arrived in Europe in the 1500s, it spread like wildfire. Within a century, it was being traded across the globe. Then came snuff, then cigars, and then, in the early 1900s, the industrially manufactured cigarette, engineered to be cheaper, faster, and more addictive than anything that had ever come before. What had taken the peoples of the Americas thousands of years to weave into a careful, sacred, deeply respected practice was, in the hands of industry, flattened into a disposable consumer product in just a few centuries. And then the 20th century tobacco industry spent decades and fortunes burying the evidence that their own scientists had found, that these products caused cancer. A healer breathing a blessing over a sick child, and a corporate executive engineering a faster nicotine hit were, in a sense, working with the very same plant. They had almost nothing else in common. So, when did we start smoking? The honest answer is that we don't know the exact moment, and we probably never will. The hard physical evidence takes us back at least 12,000 years with confidence, and the behavior behind it, the drive to breathe smoke, to alter the mind, to share that experience and use it as medicine, is surely far older still. It may be as old as fire itself. It may be as old as the very spark of intelligence that first let one of your ancestors look at a burning plant and think, "Last time that happened, I felt different. Let me do that again." That's not addiction. That's the dawn of a mind making a connection. What we know for certain is that by the time written history begins, in every corner of the world where humans lived, they were already finding ways to put smoke into their bodies. The plants changed, the reasons changed, but the behavior was already ancient before anyone thought to record it. And that's why I want you to go back one last time to that fire you were standing beside at the start. The bonfire, the fire pit, the single candle, the smoke curling up toward your face on a quiet night. For all the things that separate you from the ancestor who huddled in Wonderwork Cave a million years ago, the phones, the cities, the endless noise, there is a thin, unbroken thread that runs straight back through every one of them to you. Fire, smoke, breath. They sat by their fires and smelled exactly what you smell tonight. Some of them, somewhere, started paying attention to what that smoke did to them. And then they chose it and passed that choice down, hand to hand, across a million years, all the way into your lungs on this ordinary evening. So the next time the smoke drifts toward you and you catch yourself leaning in, just slightly, instead of turning away, understand what that small, ancient pull really is. You're not doing something new. You're doing the oldest thing in the world. You're simply breathing, the way your kind always has.